Hi, everybody. Just waiting a few seconds here for people to join. So today we're here to talk about systems thinking and organizational design. Systems concepts have been part of organizational studies for a very long time, and there are many approaches and tools out there to org design that use that systems lens and help us interpret organizational behavior and analyze our organizations and kind of shift them in the direction we want them to go through systems concepts. So today we're here to talk about some of those things, some of the theories and laws that have emerged by the organizational thinkers of our time and how those can be applied in a practical context. So I'm joined by Sergio and Hannes in this conversation. They will appear briefly. There they are. So guys, maybe as we get started, you can just briefly introduce yourselves.
Great.
Go first.
I'll pick it up. Thanks a lot for the invite. My name is Sergio Carreta. I'm HR director at Campari Group today, and long time interested in organization design. I would not define me a real expert, but with a lot of curiosity and a lot of projects being done. And I curate my personal blog where I've been chatting and babbling about some of these topics.
Hello, also from my side, Heather, thank you also for the invitation. My name is Hannes Salton. I'm a certified organization design practitioner, and in the system thinking topic quite for a while. And that's me.
Nice. I'm really glad to have you both there. So as we get started, I'm curious to know what led you to become interested in systems thinking, what led you to sort of go down this path and find this useful in your work.
Well, if I may, for me, has been, as I mentioned, I haven't studied to become to work in HR, and it happened. And as part of the HR, I hadn't studied organization design initially, but it happened through both my consulting and HR experience to enter in first process redesign, then organization design. And system thinking has been something that actually it was interesting. When I was at university, I was doing a lot of work on system thinking, and I thought it was kind of useless at that point when I was studying it. But today it's probably one of the tools that I use more in my daily work. Connecting the dots is probably the best way I can translate it to a business person from that point of view. But there is really a toolkit behind that is really useful in approaching the connection of our systems. And that's the point. And I think that with org design, system thinking it's kind of the natural extension, because that's how you can actually link in several elements. And especially from an HR point of view, that's also how you start connecting a lot of our domains, from talent to skill to people management aspects to strategy and other elements which are not typically HR, but you need to put and connect together.
Yeah, for me, my first contact was during my studies, also from a very theoretical point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And then I lost them completely out of sight, as they were, from my perspective and from my former understanding, too theoretical. Then I dived into the corporate world, and then after some years working in HR and dealing a lot with organizational change, I rediscovered, luckily, systems thinking. And so I wanted always to get a better understanding how an organization works. And I think that from my point of view, system thinking is one key concept to get a better understanding about how an organization behaves, and to drive successful organizational transformation is key to get a good understanding about the current situation. Also, especially to identify possible levels and underlying patterns of the organization itself.
Okay. Yeah, my introduction was actually quite similar. It was in my studies of political science. Particularly, I studied political institutions and conditions of change. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of theories that use system concepts, feedback loops, path dependence, all of those kind of things. And I always found it very useful in organizations, but I was always accused of being too academic and theoretical with it. So maybe that's smart in how you kind of approached it in your work. So moving on, we hear a lot about different laws related to systems and organizations, and you wrote a really interesting piece, Sergio, going into detail about this. And I think we see kind of popular theories, but then there's also just sort of like the discourse around management where people will call out, oh, it's this law at work. So I want to talk a little bit about what is a law in this context and how do you think about it? Is it like the law of gravity, or is it something that's a little bit more flexible?
Well, I think that when we're talking about laws in general in social sciences, there has been a huge debate. Are they really laws or are they not laws, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that you know, the way I've been writing my blog, and especially on this point, has been also a little bit provoking, a thought-provoking element. You know, I'm not advocating for these to be universal laws, okay? Some of these do actually recognize some patterns that we actually recognize in multiple projects, in multiple organizations, in multiple elements. But for me, these are more like conversation starters or thought elements or anchor points of a thought process. And let's just examine two scenarios for this. Sometimes when you're discussing with a manager about a potential change project or organization or elements like this, you want people to understand that there is a context of patterns that go. You know, we talk so much about benchmarking, but this makes it a little bit more general assumption. And it's interesting because very often some of these laws, in reality, they are explication of the, you know, of the black truth of the fact that change is difficult, that we need to think about the consequences of it, etc. So that's one element. And the second element, which is more as a practitioner, as we conduct this type of project, I think that these laws can be very good anchor point for reflection. We should kind of, they constitute a little bit the map in which we need to work on. Not because they're absolute truth, again, but because we need to consider them, okay, in the framework. Probably there is a third element, as you mentioned, a lot of these laws that are coming also from a lot of research of system, from a system perspective, etc. Some are really ancient. Some are just sentences that somebody has written in a book, and they kind of got into the outspace and are used, sometimes even abused. So they are, but we always need to put them a little bit into a context. So that's why it is also important around that, and we will be giving a couple of examples later on. But it's important that we kind of use them as anchor point, and that we can actually also react, especially to some managers that are abusing the sense of one versus some of the other. Again, the system perspective in this case helps.
Yeah, that's not much more to add on Sergio's point, as I completely agree with him. And but I see systems laws as possible indicators for underlying patterns to organizations. So especially when you are doing a certain intervention into a system, have to have the laws in the mind and to be conscious about when you're doing actual transformation and change activities. And yeah, just to see how the system behaves to deal effectively with them, and to avoid also possible and common pitfalls during change and transformation projects. What's your perspective on that, Heather?
I think I very much agree. I'm always very skeptical when the word law is used in social sciences, because I think oftentimes it sort of makes people turn their brains off and just assume that this thing must always be true. But I have also found these, I completely agree with both of you that they're really sort of framings of how to understand and interpret patterns that you observe. And I think in an organization, they're useful in the sense that we are all participants in the system. None of us is kind of on the outside looking in. We're all influencing the patterns and interactions that are happening. And so by using a common language to talk about these things can be very powerful to sort of bring us all together into this space and be more constructive, I guess, in our pursuit of transformation and change. So Sebastian, we just got a question about the the examples of systems laws. We are just about to go into that right now. So very well
Yes.
timed question.
Yes, indeed.
So the first one that comes up is Conway's Law, which
Mhm.
is one that has become very popularized in, I think, the last number of years, especially in software development. But maybe, Sergio, you can just start out by telling us what is Conway's Law.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Conway's Law has been used, and it's often abused, especially in software design, as you exactly mentioned. But it's a law that dates back to the 60s and actually and has been then kind of made famous by Fred Brooks' book of The Mythical Man's Man on project management type of scenarios in the 90s. And the law simply states that an organization design system mirrors, okay, the communication pattern within that organization. And very often it is translated that from a software design perspective, that the software code is actually mirroring the communication structure within the organization, okay? And very quickly, and I'm simplifying a little bit, this concept, especially has led to a lot of discussion on also how code and coding as a process should happen in an IT environment, okay? But if you think about it, this is something that we can actually also look at in broader organization context, okay? On really seeing what is the impact of the organization design of the output of the organization. I've had a lot of experience in retail, for example, and one of the elements that I've always been able to track, after so much time working in retail, when you enter into a store, just by looking at a couple of answers that in terms of customer service, you can actually start rolling back on a few elements of the organization design of the company. I'll give you one example, and I'm sure that a lot of you have had this experience. You buy something online, you go into a store because you want to change it, to exchange it, or get a refund, and you get an answer, sorry, this is not possible. You need to do it through another element. Why? Because the experience is reflecting a typical P&L channel division that the organization has, okay? And this is a very interesting aspect, especially if you join it with one note that Eric Schmidt wrote in his book, How Google Works, where he said that we should not allow, okay, people to be able to reverse engineer the organizational chart of an organization from the outcome of the organizational work. But that's the reality of what we see and do a lot of days. Talking about systems and results, how often, but just by simply analyzing a process, we end up immediately managing of looking at the silos of the organization or looking at choices that the organization has done, which sometimes is just a recognition element around that. But it's the principle behind Conway's Law, which is very interesting. And it is very interesting also for another layer of the element. The original declaration of Conway's principle talks about communication structure. So it does not tell about what we have written in terms of org chart, but it tells what the informal structure of the org chart is. And this is the other element which, from a change perspective, we also find, which is think about how many change projects do not deliver. And very often in the not delivering of this and in the result, you can actually track back not what we defined as part of the change management, but actually the informal communication structures around that. And I'm sure, Hannes, you also have a few examples around this element. Again, not getting stuck in the pure technology element, where again, Conway's laws have been discussed and rediscussed so much, but also in other organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found Conway's Law extremely interesting when you see it, when you relate it to the power and communication structures, of course, of an organization. As you can get also a quite good understanding about these underlying structures when you're having a look at actually their software systems. And this is, from my experience, a very good indicator about how power is distributed within an organization. And working with Conway's Law is it's extremely interesting, as it's on the one hand quite easy to understand and quite easy when you know what to look at to see also. Ella, did you have any experience with Conway's Law?
I do have experience with Conway's Law. So I've worked in agile roles in software development. So you can imagine it's something that comes up a lot. And I think the main kind of, I guess, risk or pitfall that I've seen is exactly what you mentioned, Sergio, about this informal network of
Yes.
communication and how
Yes.
overpowering that can be. And that a lot of times people will look at an organization, they will think about Conway's Law, they will think about something like team topologies and the reverse Conway maneuver, and then they will think, okay, well, if we move things around on our org chart, if we change, just formally the org structure, then things will kind of snap into place, and we will use domain-driven development and things like this, and then that will result in better customer value and user value. But then what you see, of course, as with any change effort, that there is this kind of formal structure, but then there is the more naturally occurring or realized structure that exists
Yes.
kind of beneath it. And that if the change is not undertaken with respect to those sort of existing power flows and communication dynamics, then it's easy to make a mess. And I think
Yes.
you always I think systems thinking offers a lot in the way of understanding what are the dynamics that you're observing, but then also how does that informal structure interact with the formal structure? How do they kind of contradict and play off of each other? I read a piece recently about a company that tried to change their org structure, and their engineering team kind of actively rebelled against the change and subverted the use of reporting tools. And they were very conscious about these sort of, we'll tell them the change is going fine, but they have to come to us for the information anyway. And so you end up with something that may be actually a lot more complex in the end. And then that sort of whole sum of the informal and formal structure is what comes forward in your customer experience.
But that, on your point, Heather, it tells us also that if you want to change the current organizational structure, you have also to look at the digital structure. And the digital structure isn't that easy to change because of some other technical connected issues. And so this is very important to bear in mind. So digital transformation also composes social transformation, and this is also very often overlooked into practice. You just need to see how digital transformation projects are kicked off, and so they just focus on the technology side, but organizations rarely bear in mind that there's also a social transformation needed to drive successful change.
Yeah, and I think if I may add, Hannes, you're hitting a spot that is in current organization really one of the elements that is more dangerous if not well thought. And what Conway's law really leads to is the fact that whatever we think in terms of organization design needs to be reflected in the information architecture that we build. Right. And one of the problems is that we rarely, and again, I put my OD aspect, but also an HR asset, we rarely start talking with our IT colleagues on exactly how to design this. And let's face it, the example that I looked at from a retail experience on the fact that we have these two different channels. Very often this is coming also from how we implemented a system like SAP. And I don't want to give always the fault always to SAP, etc. But very often this creates a rigidity in the system that is reflected in how we build our external services, how we build our internal organization, because the communication happens also on the different information technology and flows that we do. Not only through pure technology, but on everything that we actually are doing. Think about how, because when we are using it intelligently, again, think about how quickly a lot of organizations adapted during the pandemic to the remote work, because it was not the technology the problem, it was the willingness to use, etc. But how also quickly some reverted back because we have not thought about it holistically from a really architecture point of view. So these are the elements that I think, and again, coming to the initial point of, is Conway's law really universally valid? Probably not. We cannot describe it in a mathematical function, but it is an important reflection point. And I think it is also a good reflection point on the fact that when you're approaching an organization problem, it is very important to start by looking and possibly also measuring the outcomes, because from there you can track a lot of what is not working.
Yeah. So I'm going to move on to the next one because we're 20 minutes in. We have a lot that we want to talk about. But I think thinking about sort of the nature of change and the nature of resistance to change and how the power structure, the informal power structure and the formal power structure plays into that is quite relevant to our next one, which is Larman's laws of organizational behavior. So maybe one of you can talk a little bit about what is Larman's laws.
Well, Lorman's law are actually a set of laws that essentially say that the basic one says that organizations are designed to avoid change, okay, which is a big reality that we very often are facing, okay. So it is one of those elements that for me has been like, when I first read them, it's like, well, yes, this is what we face every day, but is this really a law? But no, it is really one of those elements that is probably unavoidable, because that's probably implicitly in the way organizations are set up to react around that. I think that Lerman's law are also very much known for the last one, okay, which is often abused sometimes, which is the concept of culture follows structure, okay, about one another. Let me just give one point about one of the other principle, and it is linked to the fourth law, which is the one that actually, for me, it's one of the most critically important, which is the fact that essentially change agents don't work in a change management project. And you know how much I put my hat as well, we like the idea of that we have a change project, a big one, we need change agents that are focused on doing this work. But it's interesting because what the law and the observation tells is why is it that they don't work? Because the coupling between managers and change agents doesn't work. If you give the responsibility of change to somebody else that is not the manager in the organization, then of course things start not working, because the rest of the organization is kind of made up not to work around that. And it's interesting because actually connecting also of what we discussed before, it's again the link between the formal and the informal here. It's the way the organization is set up already that will hinder the capability of us to change and impact the organization. And this is why, even if, for example, in my organization, I'm also responsible for change management, I became almost allergic to the concept of change management alone in isolation, because there are some very important theories and tools under the change management topic, but seen as a separate line in a project charter versus the rest, it implicitly means that we're missing the point. Because at the essence, what Larman's law is telling is that change initiatives in most of the organization are designed to actually reinforce the status quo rather than really doing the change. Which, if you start thinking about it, from a lot of our experience, that's how very often a new CEO coming on board will start a big change program, or a lot of changes will be moving around. And for the Italians that know the Gattopardo of Tomasi di Lampedusa, it's about a little bit of how we're changing for not changing, which is a big scenario that is pretty well known from many point of view in literature. We talk about change, but the reality is that we are not addressing it. And again, these 5 elements are really powerful on focusing the fact that if you don't adopt a systemic approach in change, you will not be able to really get the results that you want. Or correct, Hannes? I think you also have a lot of experience here.
Absolutely on your point, yes. And this is a topic that I'm particularly very interested in. And well, if we have a look at Lohmann's law more broadly, that states also that organizations are designed to maintain the homeostasis. So they aim for stability, for continuity. And once you are doing some intervention into the system starts some countermeasures to prevent the change. So this is from an organizational point of view, the key principle. And then when you're going really into the structure, as you, Sergio, has pointed out correctly, all managers and all key position holders within an organization aim to maintain their current position, if we call it power, and that's it. And so if you question the status quo, there's maybe connected a loss of power, and so loss of power is connected also uncertainty. Uncertainty, we humans don't like uncertainty, and also organizations don't like uncertainty. And this is where the Lawman's law becomes extremely interesting. And if you want to drive successful change, so you, Sergio, were completely very sharp on the point. Forget about change agents because they don't decide anything. The key point of intervention is the management, and that's it. Heather.
So Larman's laws are interesting to me because it's almost like a manifesto. It's got a little bit of sarcasm in it. It's got a little bit of
More than a little bit.
Yes, if you have experienced trying to do change, it's likely something that will really resonate with you as, yes, we've had this experience. But I do want to talk a little bit about this culture follows structure, because it's something that you hear a lot. And I think you point out, it is kind of deprived of context, the way that it's mentioned. And the irony for me about how culture follows structure is used is that very often in the sort of popular discourse, it does seem to detach that org design from change management element, like follow the structure and then everything will kind of change the structure and everything will kind of be okay. The full statement that he makes is that in big established organizations, culture, behavior, mindset follows and is influenced by changes in the organizational system and design. But in smaller, newer organizations, structure follows culture. So that already kind of implies a feedback loop. And that's always how I have understood the relationship between culture and structure. That culture sort of provides this framing of what would even occur to you to use as a structure, or how people will, fill the structure with their informal interactions. And then that structure influences kind of how that culture grows, and then it keeps going and going and going. And we definitely see that. There was another paper that went around recently, I think maybe via either the ODF or EODF, where a company did a decentralization reorganization, and the study was, I guess, about a year later, they evaluated kind of the informal information networks, and they found that the people who were leaders in the older, more centralized organization still were kind of like the hubs of communication, that still was reflected in that structure. And so I think there is this element of people in authority positions will often tend to have a status quo bias because maybe they want to retain control. But I think there's another element where it just sort of becomes part of the way of working and part of the flow of information, and people form relationships and have these dynamics, and those things work for them. And the effort of moving to a new system is more than so people kind of take the path of least resistance. I quite like Larman's laws, but indeed, it's something that you kind of hear out of context sometimes.
Yeah, no, true. And if I may, you really hit the spot on this element. And I'm going to use again one example that we have all faced. During the pandemic, so every company basically in 1 or 2 weeks has been able, to start working remotely. What is that change? Did we change the culture? No, culture doesn't change that quickly. But we had the structure in place, which, by the way, we had also before, but we did not enable. We had the structure in place to enable that. So the effect that now we have today is that in some organization, culture has already adapted to that element. What is interesting now is that you have people that are trying to move back into this, but only at the cultural layer or only at a strategic layer without reaching, because now, the technology is there, all of the rest is there. And the rebound effect of this is often negative because it's more complicated to do that. It's an interesting aspect also because very often this is one, I speak about intentionality. This is an emergent type of result that has happened. It was not intentional that we moved it, but we're looking at the effects of this. And it's a very interesting aspect that we have it. And that's why I think Larman makes a very good point also on why a lot of projects that we have been doing on trying to create new mindset in the organization, they've never really been sticking around. Whereas when we started doing things that actually changed, think about implementing Scrum, but implementing Scrum not really just as a makeup, but really changing the roles, etc. Actually, those elements make the thing stick. At the end, thinking that one comes after the other, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg discussion. We could argue for a lot of time, but it's an important aspect that in change, if you really want to have a culture change, you actually also need to identify what are the aspects of the structure that you want to change, that you need to change.
Yeah, definitely.
Nothing more to add.
And it reminds me also of the other kind of system concept you hear a lot. The purpose of the system is what it does.
Exactly.
Not
Yes.
what we wish it did, or
Exactly.
All right, so next one on our list is Goldratt's theory of constraints, which is also a very popular management technique as well.
I think, this is a very interesting law also from a system perspective, because it has been talking a lot of, the output of the system are very much linked to their weakest link, or to the bottleneck, if you would want to visualize it. But I think that the interesting aspect of the law of constraints is the fact that the constraint should not, as Goldratt mentioned, the constraint should not be fought, but should actually be embraced. This is a core an interesting aspect. Why this? Because what Goldratt has been analyzing is the fact that sometimes certain constraints you can address, but most of the time, if the constraint is a real constraint, it's not that you can actually solve it immediately. Too often, instead, the change project or transformation or new technology, etc., they focus on the constraint and they try to remove that, which, of course, you need to study if that is possible, instead of trying to really look at exploiting, which is a step 2 of his focusing step that he was mentioning. And I think this is a very interesting aspect from a systems laws perspective, because seeing the constraint as an asset rather than only on the negative side, it's for me very, very powerful on how we address this, etc. Because again, if I tie it back also to the 2 laws that we have just discussed, for example, it's interesting to consider that if I put it in relationship in Conway's law, it's not necessarily completely bad that the outputs of an organizational structure are traced to some elements to the weakest link in terms of the organization. It's an important awareness element that we need to be conscious. And we know that the concept of the law of constraints are used very often on the technical side, logistics and blah, 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 etc., where it's also a little bit easier to, let me call it, have an engineering version of this law, which, with numbers, etc. But the reality is that also where things are less mathematical, this is really a powerful thought process that we should be looking at. And let's remember one element, and again, let's connect also to Larman's element. If you think about it on our change programs, what is the biggest constraint, if not the people that are in the organization, for example? And why are we considering them the enemy instead of the enabling factor of the change sometimes? Question mark, just a reflection point.
I see. Yeah, Goldratt's law is interesting from different perspectives, as constraint is a very important stabilizing principle for systems. Otherwise, the systems would go out of control. So with constant feedback loops, and constraints are here to stabilize it, to make it a little bit manageable. And on the point that Sergio has made, when we are working on the constraint, when organizations try to remove the constraint, they often aren't aware that the constraint is moving within the system. So it moves from one point to another. So it's an ongoing cycle. And organizations really need to be aware about, because effectively managing on that, it can really improve the overall performance and the throughput of a system itself. And Yeah, and this is an interesting aspect, as the main constraint of our time is limited attention.
Mhm.
And because we as humans get so much information from different sides in real time that we cannot process. We can process information only at a certain point, and this is then the constraint. And for some people, the level is lower. For others, it's higher. And so attention is generally one key aspect that every organization needs to be aware of, especially the management attention for doing, for taking decisions, etc., to make conscious and good and well thought decisions. There's some space and there's some time needed. Otherwise, it just leads to short-term solutions that hurts on the middle and the long term the system itself. And so the Goldrat's theory of constraints can be seen on different sides, not just on the theory, on the technical, where obviously is more known, but it's also very powerful on the social side.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that systems sort of require constraints, and that oftentimes there's a focus on increasing throughput as if that is the only good, as opposed to sort of understanding how can we establish sustainable throughput, or is the thing that we are putting through something that is valuable? And there, I mean, there's the idea of buffers and delays is also quite important to system health. But I think, Sergio, you said something that I also really believe in, which is this idea that we treat people like the kind of source of resistance rather than as a source of momentum. And I think that speaks to something that I see a lot, and that I also kind of see a lot in how people apply Goldratt's theory as well, where they think of the organization as this machine, and we have our org design, and our org design would work perfectly if it weren't for all these pesky people. But the people are the organization, and organization without people is just kind of a drawing on a piece of paper. And I think, you know, probably you all have this experience, but change handled in a way that is very collaborative and co-creative and kind of respecting those innate flows can be very powerful and engaging and bring people together and establish a common sense of purpose. But then handled in a way where it is sort of imposed without respect for context, it can be, it can create a lot of negative dynamics that end up impacting the business as much as the people. And I think every one of those organizational challenges really is an opportunity to build that kind of common awareness and sense of purpose, if taken constructively. Cool. So the last one we have on our list is not exactly a systems law, but it's still something that's relevant that we hear being used a lot, which is the Pareto principle. What is the Pareto principle?
Yeah, I've added this to the list of the discussion today because I think everybody that has the experience or simply HR experience in organization keeps hearing about the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, and it cyclically comes back as if it was a universal rule that is always applicable from this point of view. And it's interesting because the origin of this law, and it's actually the Pareto distribution, which was not a law, it was an observation, okay? Wilfredo Pareto was an Italian economist of the late 17th century, where he observed that 80% of the land in Italy was held in the hands of about 20% of the population, okay? And then he applied this to multiple other scenarios, observing that that actually was consistent also in a number of other social science domains. Pareto law as a law has started to be used in the after the Second World War in the quality movement, actually in France, actually in the 50s, when we're starting to look at quality, almost as a prioritization exercise. And here comes the point of why laws can be very good, very positive, because the Pareto law as a principle can actually drive some very interesting discussion on prioritization. But if you take the shortcut that Pareto law is a scientific rule simply because everybody is known to actually see a a curve, and we absolutely know that Excel also has a functionality to draw a Pareto curve, you end up into a problem because you might be missing some of the elements. And I think that's why I think that for me, it's not just looking at Pareto law as such alone, but it's actually also looking how the Pareto law ties into with something which has a little bit more of a systemic approach today, which is the long tail effect. Okay, because this is where, in many point of views, organizations sometimes, by using the Pareto law as a simplistic prioritization exercise, they might be losing opportunities. And I'll be just using a business concept for 1 second, a strategy concept, but you can imagine that the element can be applied very easily to a lot of other domains. We totally know that there are a lot of companies that they start pruning their customer base because they want to focus only on the 20 customers that give that 80% of the result. Let's do it also internally. So we cut 80%, we focus on the 20% of talent that delivers 80% of the result. And we go through this adaged kind of simplification process in it. But what about the rest? Okay. Again, in a business concept, in a business context, we know that technology has been a key enabler in many cases of the big long-tail effect. Think about Amazon. Think about the marketplace that you actually have on Amazon. Amazon has been able to optimize the fact that actually it makes business not just by focusing on a 20%, but by being the place where you find everything. Okay. And it's interesting if you look at companies that are able to exploit both a high prioritization. I use Apple as an example. You notice how often Apple cut completely lines of product, physical product, which were not relevant anymore. Okay. But on the other side, it has iTunes, it has all of these marketplace, the App Store, etc., which instead use the long tail effect. So I think that for me, it's an important, the Pareto effect or the Pareto law is, for me, it's an important element to underline that some of these laws or some of these statements are dangerous to treat, or just to leave them out in the open as, oh, this is the rule and we need to always do that. Because very often when you're cutting, and again, I'll give an example, the moment that you're cutting, that you're focusing only on the 20% of your current big customers and you cut the rest, you're probably cutting the customer that has the potential to grow and become one of your top, in the top 20, for example. Or same, if you cut your product lines this way, you actually might be hindering your opportunities for growth from the future. And this is one of those elements where our systemic approach should be always not an and or, because often that's what the Pareto laws is triggering, but a both and type of approach. We should be focusing both and differentiating. That's the key word here. It's the differentiating, is not cutting, but it's actually looking at differentiation options. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, a little bit more of a provocation. Pareto law is not strictly a systems law, but it is one of those elements that is so abused and used across that I think we need to, it's one of those elements that needs to be part of our OD toolkits, as Diego remembered the next comment before, but we need to know how to treat it well.
Yeah.
Hannes, what do you think?
Well, to be honest, I'm not that familiar with the Pareto principle in terms of system thinking, but so I'm very thankful for your explanation about how it relates to the systems laws and also about the long tail effect. And yeah, this is more or less my understanding. And so I have nothing to add at this point. I will pass the ball directly to you, Hedda.
Okay. I'm really glad that you pointed out how a principle like this can be abused, because the way that I see, if we take, for example, a statement like 80% of the value is produced by 20% of the employees, there's a lot of downsizing that's been going on. And there are a lot of studies that find that companies that undergo downsizing face a difficult road in recovering their capabilities. And I think a lot of that becomes almost an anti-system or system ignorant, I guess, way of looking at things, because that 20% very likely depends on the 80% for a lot of their ability to be effective. And then we also know, particularly in knowledge work, that knowledge is social and that organizational capabilities are embedded in networks of people. And so if you go in and you start slicing pieces out, then you might be kind of severing ties and losing knowledge that you can never recover, and you might not even be aware is there in the first place. And so I think as we start to wrap up here, I think this is a very important underlying point in this discussion, which is that all of these ideas and laws and principles are really just ways to help you think about situations, and not things to turn into a religion or a dogma that is always true in every case. And I'm a strong believer in that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is actually a law also for that I managed to scout. It's called the Sturgeon's law. Actually, it's a science fiction writer, but he wrote this sentence, which is quoted often, which tells nothing is always absolutely so, which is an interesting aspect, because nothing is always written in stone. Nothing is always scientifically like that, especially in the domains that we work through. And this also should put our work into perspective as we help organization, because we need to adapt everything. Everything needs to be handled in terms of what is the real situation, what are the data, what are the numbers that we're getting, what are the actual scenarios. And for me, this is the point around this element. We need to make sure that we do a serious job where we need to adapt ourselves and not just take, copy and paste certain elements from the outside.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And from my perspective, so system thinking is very, very helpful to think really through design options, and also when defining design principles or also design criteria. And yeah, and the world is not, in organizations, is neither black or white, but always some shades of gray. And this is where the systems laws can be very helpful in driving successful transformation.
Yeah, agreed. And I think systems law is also, or systems thinking is also an important capability for really any manager, anyone in a leadership role to have, to understand how to build better teams. And so we're going to wrap up here. I will say one thing that I like to say to people that I work with is, if it was easy, anybody could do it. So indeed, the world is a little more complicated than we would like it to be.
Exactly.
Are there any last words you would like to leave us with?
I'm fine. I think thanks a lot for the invite. Thanks a lot also for the opportunity of sharing, and look forward also to continue the conversation in the various digital formats that allow it, if there is anybody that has further curiosity on this.
Thank you also from my side. I enjoyed really much the conversation with you. Yeah, we could continue also the whole afternoon, as this is very relevant from the area we're working in. And so, yeah, everyone have a good time, enjoy. And yeah, and to our audience, dive into system thinking is well worth, and it's very interesting to dive into this fascinating universe of organizational design.
All right. Well, thank you both, and thanks everybody for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you.